Welcome to the Adoption and Foster Care Journey, a podcast to encourage, educate, and equip you to care for children and youth through adoption, foster, and kinship care. Hosted by an adoptive mom with over 22 years of kinship and adoptive parenting experience. She's on this journey with you. Please welcome Sandra Flack.
Pure and genuine religion in the sight of God our Father means caring for orphans and widows in their distress and refusing to let the world corrupt us. Of course, that is James 1:27. Welcome to the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast. I am so grateful for you to be joining me today for our first episode of November, kicking off National Adoption Month. Always very reminiscent for me this time of year because it was in November of 2006 that we traveled to Ukraine to bring home 3 of our children. So this time of year, this season always makes me very nostalgic. I go back and read my journals from the trip and just has a special place in my heart. So, and actually we have a guest on with us today who is an adoptive dad of some kiddos also from Ukraine. So I can't wait for you to meet him. But first, please check out these important announcements.
Natalie Vecchione of the FASD Hope podcast and Sandra Flack of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast would like to invite you to join their Hope for the FASD Journey, a virtual support community for parents and caregivers raising individuals with an FASD, diagnosed or not. This faith-based community includes an online bi-monthly support group, a monthly VIP conversation, and a private Facebook group which includes a video devotional from Natalie and Sandra every Saturday. To register, visit justicefororphans.ny.org/training/FASD.
Great resources that we have for you. I'm also offering coaching sessions now. So if you are looking for more of a one-on-one walk through the facets neurobehavioral model, I'm available for that. You can sign up for any of our training, sign up for the support group or the coaching at our website, justicefororphansny.org. There is a 3-hour workshop coming, an online workshop that I'll be leading on FASD. It is scheduled for Wednesday, November 29th. So the end of the month, it's at 7 p.m. Eastern time. And we will be exploring the symptoms of FASD, going through a little bit, touching on the neurobehavioral model, which is a brain-based approach of caring for kids who were prenatally exposed to alcohol. So again, link in the show notes if you're looking for any of that training, checking out our resources on our website. Also, please subscribe to this podcast or follow it. If you're new, you may be catching us on YouTube. So we have the regular audio version of our podcast out there on all of the podcast platforms, but we're also now posting all of the video of these podcasts on YouTube, so you can check them out there. So I hope you'll follow and subscribe wherever it is you're finding us. We're grateful to have you tune in, and I am grateful also for our guest. I guess that wasn't really good for video. I just swiped the screen with my notes, but I want to make sure that I introduced our guest accurately. We have Dr. Rick Morton. He is the Senior Vice President of Engagement at Lifeline Children's Services. Prior to Lifeline, Rick served for 15 years as a college and seminary professor. He has also served local churches in Tennessee, Louisiana, and Mississippi. He is an accomplished writer and a sought-after speaker. Most notably, Rick is the co-author of the popular book Orphanology, Awakening to Gospel-Centered Adoption and Orphan Care, and the author of No Orphans, KNOW, No Orphans, Mobilizing the Church for Global Orphanology. Rick and his lovely wife, Denise, have been married for over 32 years, and they have 3 children with special needs adopted from Ukraine. Dr. Rick has a special burden for vulnerable children and has dedicated his life to helping them. So please welcome Dr. Rick Morton. Welcome, Dr. Rick.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It is great to have you. I'm so excited to talk to another fellow parent of kiddos from Ukraine. I know we were chatting prior to hitting record about that, and just so excited to have you here for National Adoption Month. And I would love to just start with the beginning of your story. What led you and your wife to pursue adoption?
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of a long, involved story, but the short version is we struggled with infertility for a number of years, and that led us on a quest in a lot of different ways to just desperately wanted to be parents, and along the way, my wife just began praying about our situation, and the Lord really led her to conviction that we should adopt. And I'll be honest, and I've said this in 2 books and more articles than I can count at this point. I didn't share that conviction. I remember sitting at dinner and her bringing it up, and she said, I think we should consider adoption. I think, God has something there for us. And I don't even think I put my fork down. I just said, no chance.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, adoption sounded complicated. It sounded difficult. I had visions of that guy with some sort of camera crew and some revelation or birth parent or something like that. And just, like had a view of adoption that it was hard, and probably didn't have 2 things I think were relevant. One, I didn't have many good examples in my own life of adoptive families. We grew up in an era where you didn't talk about those sorts of things. Parents, didn't talk about those sorts of things. And so that was part of it. But also, growing up in the church, like we didn't talk about it in the church either. And we certainly didn't talk about it in theological terms at all. And so my wife didn't play fair. And so she didn't do the conventional thing. She didn't start, like putting pictures of waiting kids up around the house, or, leaving open Bibles to, James 1:27 or Ephesians 1 or whatever around, and those sorts of things. She just prayed, and she just prayed very earnestly that the Lord would either change her heart or change my heart. And she was very honest before the Lord, and said, God, I think you've given this to me. And so if it's not of you, take it away. But I also trust that you're the God that, holds the hearts of kings in your hand and directs them to streams as you would have them to go. So my knucklehead husband is really no match for you. So it changed his heart. And that's really what God did. I was teaching. I was a seminary professor at the time, and so it wasn't like I was somebody that didn't know the scriptures or didn't have an understanding of of the Bible on some level. But God really began to just chase me. I know, Charles Spurgeon, I think maybe was the one, I don't know who said it, but this idea about being pursued by the hounds of heaven. I kind of know what that feels like. And really what I began to do is I just, I started to get into the Bible, and I was in a period of life where I was very focused on looking at the Bible in chronology, and really trying to understand the story as it unfolded, and what was God trying to communicate to us through the big grand story of Scripture. And so I started looking at orphan care and adoption in terms of the chronology of Scripture, and it really changed the way that okay. So I really, Sandra, I kind of know what, if it was Spurgeon or whoever said it, about being pursued by the hounds of heaven, because God really convicted my heart, and it caused me to go to the scriptures. I was in a point and in a time in life when I was really captivated by studying the scriptures in chronology, and really trying to understand God's heart and understand redemptive history from how things laid out across the ages as scripture was delivered. And so I started to look at orphan care and adoption that way. And what I found was that our care for vulnerable children, our care for vulnerable families, as it plays out in the Old Testament and the New Testament, is really a deeper it's a deeper understanding of God's redemptive heart and how we as his people should be living that out and displaying it. And so it didn't answer all of my questions, but what it did answer for me was, if the Lord is opening a door for us to adopt, that is something that both is practically good, but it also is something that God endorses, that like God is for. And that provided enough confidence in the moment to step out and to start an adoption process. And from there, I'll be honest, and I'll just kind of wind up by saying we didn't have one big fat wide clue about where we were going to go or what we were going to do. And so we went through training to become foster parents. We went through training to possibly adopt an infant domestically. We did everything that we needed to do in our home study and our training for international adoption. And then Ukraine just started to pop up in our world in ways that were crazy and unexpected. And my joke for years has been, I went to public school in the 80s. I couldn't find Ukraine on a map, and part of the reason was because it didn't exist on a map when I was in school. And so we but over time, God just began to continue to point us toward Ukraine. And so in 2003, we committed to the process of beginning an international adoption, and that led to us bringing our first son home. He was 18 months old. He came home in January of 2004, and that was the beginning of our journey. And there have been incredible twists and turns, and lots of joy and lots of hard stuff. And some days it's been so hard I wish the guy from Dateline would show up, because that might be easier than some of the stuff that that we've walked through as a family. But the truth is, as we've moved deeper into this, and as we've gone farther through it, we still, as a family, love it, believe in it, and are thankful that that God built our crazy, weird family through adoption.
Yeah, I love that. So much of our story sort of overlapped, because I know the Lord started with me also when it came to adoption. And my husband, I remember him saying, that's a nice idea. Maybe one day we'll do it. But he was not ready to just do it. So same thing. I had to pull out that secret weapon of prayer and just trust that if the Lord was calling us to it, he would get a hold of my husband's heart, which in time he did. Yeah. And then our reason for going to Ukraine was the church that we were in at the time. The pastor's adult daughter was a missionary with YWAM in Kyiv. And our church would frequently do missions trips. So I had been there, and I had been in orphanages there, and I knew that's what the Lord was calling us to do. So we never even considered anything else as an option. We just knew it was Ukraine. And I think after our adoptions, if anybody else would have come to me and said, "Oh, we're thinking about adopting, maybe we'll adopt from Ukraine," I probably would have said, "No, it's not that easy." There's so many other better options probably, but when the Lord leads you to a certain place, he's got a plan, right? And we know that the kids that we brought home were the kids that he intended to place into our family. So you said 2004, you brought home a son who was 18 months old. And then
18 months old.
Give us the order of when the other kiddos joined your family.
So then our second child, we adopted he came home in 2010. And he was, is that right? No, 2009. I'm sorry. He was 7 at the time. And that's a crazy story. Hurricane Katrina intervened in our lives for a season. And so we were living in New Orleans. I was teaching at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary at the time. And so we had just started the process of moving toward our second adoption. And we spent a year and a half, washed out of our home and kind of in disarray as we recovered from from the hurricane. And so we were definitely not on the timeline that we wanted to be on. One of the things that I teach or have taught is human development. So we were definitely not on the timeline that we thought, we would be on. And I had, in my teaching career, had taught human development. We were committed to the idea that we wanted to stay in birth order and all these things. And the Lord really used that time that we were waiting, and the time when we couldn't move forward in our adoption, to really change our hearts towards the needs of older kids. We had an opportunity to meet some kids along the way that were, school age kids that were in need of families. And so, again, gave us enough confidence to step out and say, okay, we're going to open our parameters. And for those folks, then this is going to sound really weird for people that haven't, done this, particularly that haven't done it from Ukraine, but you go to Ukraine not having a match, right? Like you're blind when you walk in, and they're going to put a bunch of files in front of you. And then it's, okay, now choose one. And so, we prayed and prayed and prayed and agonized over what that moment was going to be like. And, and really just committed to the Lord that, God, whatever file they set down first, that's who's ours. And unless you do something different, that's what we're going to do. And so we did. And, our Nicholas was that file. And there were things about his file that helped us to know right from the very beginning that it was going to be challenging. He had been visited by several families who had begun the process to adopt him, but then it halted at some point. And we were actually told in the beginning that he had another family that had come to pursue him, and he wouldn't even meet with them. And so we just, prayed and persevered, and we traveled to Odessa to the little orphanage that he was in, and we went not knowing if he would even consent to see us, and he did. And now he's 22 years old and is just a huge part of our family. And he and all of those things that were concerning in his file in one way or another have been things that have concerned us and have been a part of our lives to this day. And I know, Sandra, one of the reasons that I'm always excited to talk to you and something that we have in common is having kiddos that have been affected by FASD, and our Nicholas is one of those kids as well. And so we, it was tough. It was hard for the first couple of years. It was hard for our boys together to, figure out life together, and, trying to be brothers in the midst of that. There was a lot of conflict in our home. We struggled with all kinds of behavioral interventions and things that didn't work. And I remember we went to CAFO in Minneapolis, I think. So whatever year that was, and my wife and I split up and went different directions for seminars, and she went to a workshop, and she came and found me, and she grabbed me by the arm and she said, "You're going to this next seminar with me, and you're going to sit in this lady's seminar for however long she chooses to teach, for as many as she chooses to teach." And I'm like, "Okay, yes, ma'am." And little did I know that was Karen Purvis. And Denise drug me into Karen's workshop, and it changed our lives to some degree. Beginning to learn more about trauma-informed care, beginning to learn about the needs of our children at a deeper level, began to make things click. Of course, and folks on this podcast have heard, like, it didn't make everything click, particularly when you have a child whose brain development has been affected by substance abuse, and that's not a one-for-one exchange, but certainly it helped things and it changed things. I was pretty committed after the second one to not do it again. And so I was that guy one more time. There's a pattern if you can start to see it develop. And so our way of not adopting again and saying, "Hey, our quiver is full," was we're gonna start doing some orphan hosting. And so we're gonna bring groups of kids to the States. We did it a little differently than a lot of the hosting models that you see around. And so we brought a group of kids, and it was more like a camp experience. And adoption was really not the first thing that we were thinking about. It really kind of wasn't the thing at all. These were all older kids. They were between like 11 and 17. And it was really more of we just kind of wanted to show them unconditional love for a few weeks, and to be able to expose some people here in our church to the kinds of things and the kind of kids that we'd met, in Ukraine. And so we brought the first group. They spent 3 amazing weeks with us, and all living together at one family's house. It was nuts. We just had the right conditions for that to be able to work. They had a big house and a big farm, and it was awesome. And we put them on a plane, and no one of those kids, kind of seemed to captivate our hearts more than any other. And there wasn't, like I tell people, there wasn't this moment where there was like a bright spotlight on anybody, and music didn't play in the background or anything like that. But the Lord just began a journey over about the next 8 months, where I was, there was just one of those kids that I could not get off my mind. And so I just kept praying, but I was scared to death to talk to my wife, because we were in it. We were like up to our eyeballs in, everything. And we were in no place, spiritually, emotionally, financially, anything else to really consider an adoption at that point, in my opinion. And so I just didn't talk about it. And finally one night we were, laying in bed, both of us were reading, and I just, like, I couldn't stand it. And I finally just turned to my wife and I said, I got something I got to tell you. I've been holding on to something for 8 months now, and I just need to confess. I should choke up. She finished my sentence.
Mm.
She said, "We need to adopt Nastia." And it was like, holy cow. So we sat there and talked, and we agreed that we were not financially or emotionally or spiritually in any way ready to do that, and that the Lord was going to have to do something amazing for us to be in a place to be able to do that. And so we committed between us that we were going to pray about that together, but we were not going to tell anyone. We didn't tell our kids, we didn't tell our friends, we didn't tell our family, we didn't tell anybody. But the Lord began to do some things. He began to do some things in our kids. He began to do some things in our lives. He began to do some things in revealing some things that we could do in parenting that helped the temperature of our home. God began to do some things in us spiritually as we, grew, and but still just not ever telling anybody. And we were kind of rocking along. And my accountability partner called me up one day and he said, "Hey, I need to talk to you." And when somebody you're in an accountability relationship says that to you, that's either
You're like,
you or them,
oh.
right? Like it's like, ah. And so I so I'm like trying to go, oh, because I'm thinking in the back of my mind, like, I don't know anything about me. So, like, what's up? And so I kind of, said to him, I'm like, well, what's up? Like what, that you sound really serious. And he just said to me, he said, I've just been observing you and I've seen something that I just need to talk to you about in person. And I'm like, what in the world? I mean, talk about self-examination.
Yeah.
And so it's like this, oh, wow. And so he took me to lunch, and he took me to this Mexican restaurant that we went to all the time, but he was sitting all the way in the back in the shadows, like way away from everybody else. And so it had this whole ominous feel to it. And I sat down and I, very nervously tried to make a little chit chat. And finally, I'm like, why are we here? And he just said, I've been watching you for months. And we were together, like we were a part of a board that was doing this orphan hosting program. And he said, I've been watching you, and I see your face every time you see Nastia's picture. And he just looked at me and he said, is God up to something? Are you supposed to adopt her? Well, wow. 12 years later, I'm crying. You can't imagine how I was in that moment. It was, and so finally I did. And I confessed to him and I said, yeah. And we've been praying about it for, all these months, and we didn't even talk to each other about it. And now, and there's no way. And, just started like babbling all this stuff. And he looked at me and he said, and, true story, no preacher add on to this. He said, why? And so I told him, and he said, and so I will just say in short, friends of ours, provided resources for us to be able to do that. People came alongside us in ways to, to help us to be able to bring our daughter home. And so we adopted a 14-year-old, and totally not what we would have ever planned. It hasn't been easy. It's been crazy. But our daughter now is 26, 28. Sorry, I don't do math well. I went to seminary. So she's 28. 14 years we've been in this journey together. She's the mama of a beautiful 6-year-old little girl, and has a great little family and a thriving career, and is doing great. And so Sandra, that's a long way around to say we're launching 2 adults that are 20 and 21 and 22 that are still trying to figure life out, but are working and are out there and taking the next steps, and a 28-year-old that is raising her family. And And by God's grace, we also fell in love with Ukraine along the way.
Yeah.
And so I've been 26 times and have
Wow.
taught at Key Theological Seminary for a number of years, taught church planners there, and have served with mission teams and alongside
Wow.
other opportunities. But God gave us three beautiful kids, and He also gave us a second home out of the deal. So
Mm.
it's a pretty good deal.
Wow. So much of your story. It's like I was taking notes because there was things I wanted to make sure I went back to do. So it's just so interesting. So we traveled the first time we went to Ukraine to adopt. We also traveled blind, where we had no idea.
Yeah.
And we had that same, we were praying because we felt like, well, God knows who they are, right? God knows who,
Right.
because we knew we were going to adopt a sibling group, whether it be two or we were approved for three. But how would we know? Like, we want to make sure we make that right decision, right? We didn't want to pick wrong. And I remember the first pictures they laid in front of us, very similar to your story. It was three siblings. They were 3, 7, and 9. And the youngest was a boy. And in my thinking and all of my imagining about adopting children from Ukraine, I always pictured the youngest as a girl. So I'm like, and I asked to see more pictures. We asked for more. So they put like 2 girls, a boy and a girl. Like, they put a few more pictures out in front of us. And I always describe it as like playing that game Hot and Cold, where you're, looking for something and the person says, oh, you're getting colder, you're getting hotter, whatever. And it was like, the more pictures they put in front of us, I felt like the colder the trail was getting. And I just kept looking at those 3 little faces that they first placed in front of us, because those pictures stayed in front of us. And it was like, okay, God, silently I was praying, how do we know? And I just sensed the Lord say, these 3 are the least of these. And that scripture from Matthew 25 was a big part of God leading us to adopt. So then at the same time, my husband like elbowed me and said, well, what do you think? And I'm like, he was on board, and then we were approved to adopt 2. And then, long story, our paper, like, the Ukraine closed down. I think it was early 2006, they shut down. So we were waiting to travel during that time. So then all of our paperwork expired. Everything had to be redone. And I'm like, if I have to do this all over again, let's up the number. Let's try, let's get approved for 4 kids. And my husband was like, so we compromised on 3 kids because 4 kids was like that deer in the headlights. So, I'm thinking he's not going to be really thrilled when I say I think it's these 3, when there's like options for 2 and 2. But when I said I think it's these 3, he said, I think you're right. So, we brought home those 3, and then we found out after we were home. Well, I shouldn't say that. My husband went home because we had kids at home. And the day I picked the 3-year-old up from the orphanage, I just happened to ask our facilitator, how would we know if there's any more? Because there were 3 biological siblings and they were young. And they're like, oh yeah, there is one more. And he's in this orphanage, but he's just not available yet for adoption. And it was like, what? So I got to see him from a distance, and then just really went home, and we just agreed to keep it between us and the Lord, and what the Lord would do with it. And then we were home. I think we were home about 3 months, and our oldest biological son said, what if there's more? And we're like, what if there is more? Because we didn't tell anybody. And he said, well, we'd have to go get them, because it wouldn't be fair if we're all here and they're still over there. So I felt like that testimony that, okay, we didn't like destroy our family by bringing home 3 extra kids, right? 3 kids. But we still didn't say anything. And then we were home. The kids were home about 9 months when the oldest Ukrainian boy said, I have a brother. He had enough English at that point where he and we never told him, and that he was in an older, a school, an orphanage for the older kids. The youngest one was in the baby house. So he'd never met him. We had no idea he even knew anything about him. But our facilitator, before we came home from Ukraine, told him, you still have a brother here. So by the time he was able to say, I have a brother, And we knew it was time to go back. So
Yeah.
long story short, but we may have been in Ukraine very similarly in 2010, because we traveled in 2010 to bring home number 4.
Yeah.
We were there in October of 2010. Curious
Wow.
when you traveled.
We were there a little bit later. So we were actually there December and January. We overlapped
Wow.
December and January. But yeah, but very close in time frame.
Yeah.
It's
That's incredible.
amazing. Sandra, we went all 3 times we went expecting to adopt a sibling group. Even with our daughter had a sister, and it's a long story, but we came home with three individual children every time, expecting that we would have brought a sibling group home. And so it's just, it's amazing to see the way that people's stories are, so similar, yet different.
Yeah.
But it was funny when you were telling your story when you were on our podcast. I was having the same kinds of moments, going, oh my goodness, like we've lived very, very similar lives, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah, the overlap is just incredible. And so I know you mentioned you said their ages, but how old is everybody now?
So our daughter now is 28. Our sons are 22 and 21. And so our baby that came home at 18 months he's now 21. And
Wow.
yeah,
Incredible.
so we're entering that next phase of life.
Yeah. So the FASD piece is interesting, because now we are, the first 3 kind of clicked in. I mean, it was blessed chaos, but there wasn't major behavioral problems that we were dealing with. But when we brought home number 4, the second we met him in the orphanage, really, we knew, like, we're not prepared to parent this kiddo, and highly suspected prenatal alcohol exposure. And then eventually the younger 2 did get that diagnosis. They were 6 and 8, and they both were diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. And then our regular listeners know we got no resources or supports. It was just, here's your diagnosis, have a nice day. So how did you pursue getting diagnosis for, is it 2?
Yeah.
Is your,
well,
tell
both,
us
so
the
both
FASD
of our,
part.
yeah, so both of our boys have, have some things going on. Our youngest is he's on the autism spectrum. So he's what previously would have been called an Asperger's kid. And so, we knew from very early on with him that there were some things that were different. And we began to see some very telltale signs of, that pointed us toward the idea that, that it was probably something on the autism spectrum. We, fortunately or unfortunately, he has a dad with a PhD in education and a mom who spent 15 years as a special ed teacher before she retired to stay home with him and with the rest of our gang. And so that from, there was somewhat of an ability for us to know how to seek services and know what to do. We also, I left teaching and moved into back into the local church, and the church that I was serving. Our chairman of deacons was a behavioral pediatrician who actually served on President Bush's council for ADHD. And he was an incredible gift to us right off the bat to really dive in and help us with a lot of testing, a lot of just a lot of consultation about where to go and what to do. When we brought our second home, it was pretty obvious that we were dealing with something that was different. It didn't take a long time to figure out that that a whole lot of the conventional things that we knew and had learned were not probably extremely helpful with him. And we struggled, quite frankly, for years to get a final diagnosis and to really nail down the FASD portion of his story. But I think Yeah. So a lot of what even has happened to us in not just our family, but even in ministry over, over these years is responsive to the journey that we've been on with our kids. Um, we have been, Denise and I both have been invested in planning a ministry here at Lifeline called Bridge Educational Services. And really our focus is um, working with kids that have, that have come from hard places, working with kids that have learning differences, and leveraging brain plasticity the best that we know how today. And so really taking a neurobiological approach to education, um, trying to bring more of a social emotional focus to those things that we do that are, that are honoring to what we know in neurobiology. And so we're trying to really bring together all the worlds of all the things that, that folks that are, that are in our space kind of understand and believe in. But a big part of that journey, honestly, was fighting for our own kids and advocating for them, and the, the unfolding journey. And I mean, I've seen and read and heard enough of your story to know that we started out in all this at a time when nobody knew much of anything, and
Right.
and what half of what we did know was wrong, and the other half was scary, and pretty dark and depressing and hope. And there's still very, very hard things that are, that are a part of, part of walking alongside an adult who has some, pretty significant struggles with the way that he perceives the world, and his ability to make decisions, and discriminate information, and all those sorts of things. And those things don't go away, but we have a much better sense of how to support him, and we have a much better sense of how to come around him as we support him, because of what we know today. So our and a lot of, quite honestly, I think a lot of our quest is to just, we want to dedicate the rest of our lives to making sure that families that come behind us that have the same sorts of challenges have better resources, have better information, and have better access.
Yeah, that's what I'm all about too. The more I have learned and the more I've recognized how prevalent prenatal exposure to alcohol is among especially the population of kids in foster care and adoptive homes, the more I'm just passionate about every caregiver being able to have that, to be equipped to understand what it is and what those symptoms are, and then how to come alongside and accommodate and support our kids so that they can be successful. And it is a lifelong journey. So such similar stories we have. It's so exciting. One of the things, because I've also read your book, the Orphanology book, which I pulled off my shelf and said, oh, there it is. I still have it. And you talk a little bit about that, that gospel-centered piece, right? So, we're talking here, adoption is not an easy journey. There's a lot of challenges, but why? Why should believers prayerfully consider adoption?
Yeah, I think it's, first of all, there are things that I said, however many years ago when we wrote Orphanology, that I don't know that I would say today. But I think the truth is, we're all called to be in the work of caring for orphan and vulnerable children. Every family is not called or cut out to adopt.
Right.
And I don't say that because I, try to act like, we've got it all together. It's anything but that. It's, I think, what man starts a project without counting the cost? And that's, there's a biblical concept to consider even there, that the cost of adoption is, can be quite high. And I think, we have to talk truthfully about those things. But and I think back early on in the Christian adoption and orphan care movement, we equated a lot of the movement with adoption. And so like adoption was like the thing that you're supposed to do. And I just think that's terrible thinking. And it's proven out to be over time. Nevertheless, I believe that adoption is exactly the right solution for some children, and it's exactly the right plan for some families. And so I think if it incumbent upon us, we, those of us that are in this space, we need to be preparing families. We need to be investing in them. We need to be building churches that are prepared to wrap around them and provide, supportive community for them. All of that ultimately has a way of putting the gospel on display. You can't tell the story of your family. I can't tell the story of my family and who we are and how we've come together, that the story of who our family is doesn't kick the door wide open to us being able to tell the story of the gospel.
Right.
The story that God has made outsiders insiders, the story that God has adopted us into his family. And that doesn't say so much about our families as much as it says about him, because we know we're not perfect parents. We know that we didn't save or rescue anybody, and that we didn't, we don't have the power to do those things. But truly, like, you can't enter in and do this work, or you can, but you shouldn't enter in and do this work without a view as a believer to how this demonstrates the gospel in big and small ways, and that part of what we can't ever let this become, I think, is it's not just good social science. It's not just good political action. It's not just good, humanitarian work. We as believers are called into this because this is who our Father is, and because of how he relates to us, and because of how he cares for his creation. And so we as his children, we just want to find really practical ways to be like him, and adoption is one of those ways. And so in a world where it's not in vogue to say that sometimes, and in a world where we kind of almost put adoption at arm's length, and we don't want to talk about international adoption, there are kids all over the world that will not be able to be adopted in in their home country. And none of us that are advocating for international adoption are advocating for anything other than kids that can't be placed in their home country to be placed elsewhere. And so again, we're part of what we have given our lives to is seeding and catalyzing adoption movements in other countries to raise up Christians who are living this way and doing these things, and are engaged in foster care and engaged in adoption in their own context, and in their own country, and doing it with tools and resources and things that help them to be, incredibly effective in that. But the gospel piece of it is that the thing that motivates us, the thing that drives us and keeps us in it, is nothing other than who God is, and how he's called us to tell the story of his redemptive work, and to tell the story of Jesus. And we get the privilege of doing that as adoptive families, just because that's who we are. That's our story.
Well said. And I love that, because like James 1:27, which you mentioned earlier, we're all called, right, to care for the orphan, the vulnerable. It's not necessarily through adoption. There may be some of us are called to bring children into our homes, but not every, we also need foster parents. We also need respite providers. We also need to support churches and organizations in other countries who are trying to do family preservation work in those countries, so kids can stay in their home country. There's so many ways. Go ahead.
Well, Sandra, I probably said this 1,000 times, but I think James 1:27, you point that out. That's the verse we all run up the flagpole, and that's kind of the simple thing for us. But it's interesting to me in the church that we have looked at caring for vulnerable children and caring for vulnerable women as optional. We've looked at it as work for only some people in the church. Well, why don't we look at the second half of the verse as optional? Because nobody thinks keeping oneself unstained from the world, nobody's walking around saying personal holiness is just something for a segment of the church. We're all saying we're called to be like Jesus, and we're all called to pursue holiness. But yet we become comfortable in the church saying that's just a few people that have that calling. No, that's a general specific calling to everyone in the church. And so there's something everybody can do. And the job of people like, you and me and a lot of others is just to bang the drum and to, help to show people what the opportunities are.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that you're doing is you also host a podcast, which I had the opportunity to be on, the Defender podcast. So tell our audience who may not know about your podcast about that.
Yeah. So Herbie Newell, our executive director here at Lifeline, and I host the Defender podcast, and it is essentially, it's kind of what it sounds like. We're we believe that we've been called, and so every week we take a different angle at looking at ways that we can step in to work on behalf of vulnerable families and vulnerable children for the sake of Christ. And we have all kinds of guests and all kinds of people, and some of them are close to home and people that are part of our team here. Others are folks that are speaking on a much bigger stage, and and have a very significant message, and so would love for you to join us on that, and just also would just invite folks to our ministry at Lifeline. We try to have answers and solutions that are gospel centered and gospel focused all the way along the continuum. And so everything from, women that find themselves in crisis pregnancy all the way to, children that are in need of temporary care through foster care or adoption or family reunification work, or even kids that are going to age out of the system without permanency, both here at home and around the world. We have things that we can do to help mobilize your church in all of those areas. And we'd love to talk to you about it. So on the Defender podcast, we just take little pieces of that and talk about it all the time.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about Lifeline, and give us the website. We'll put a link in the show notes, but tell us about Lifeline.
So our website is lifelinechild.org. Lifeline exists to equip the body of Christ to manifest the gospel to orphan and vulnerable children. And that just very simply means that we're here to prepare the church to do the work that the church has been called to do. And we have work currently in 26 different countries. We work in or have child placing licenses in 18 states, but we literally work around the U.S. and work in all 50 states in some capacity. And much of what we do is just about giving the church the training and the resources and the platform for churches to be able to do this work. And we can literally do those things anywhere with anyone. And so if you're in a church where you have an orphan care ministry, or you have a ministry to vulnerable children or vulnerable families, there's probably something we can do to help you. If you're in a church where you haven't quite figured that out yet, but you want to, we can come alongside and help with that as well. And literally all of that and all those resources can be found at lifelinechild.org. Get in touch with us. We'd love to connect with your church, and we'd love to help any way we can.
Yeah, great organization doing great work. And what about your book, Orphanology? Where can our listeners grab a copy of that?
Yeah, so Orphanology, there's also a follow-up that came out called No Orphans, KNOW, No Orphans, and that's a little bit more focused toward international orphan care and international adoption. But both of those, you can find them on Amazon or any of the places where books are sold. And Orphanology. I think I did, while we were sitting here, I did actually look, and it was published in 2011.
Mhm.
So holy cow, like what, that was a long time ago. But I still get royalty checks that are of the size to allow me to get a small fry at McDonald's. So somebody's still buying it. And I think there's some things in there that might be able to be helpful, although I will acknowledge that there's some things that are dated that probably don't apply to today. But Orphanology really is just, our heart in writing the book was to say, if you're an average person in an average church, what can you do to respond to James 1:27? And it's just stories of people that have found really exceptional ways to be able to step in and to do something about the orphan crisis.
Yeah, I love that. And I know books are, we write our books and then they're out there and then we grow when we learn. And, same way my book came out and I was really just scratching the surface in the FASD space when my book was released. So there's a little tiny bit about FASD in there.
Yeah.
But now it's like, I wish I had written so much more about it. So I have another book brewing that is more FASD specific, but I know.
Well, you're more courageous than I am. I don't have the strength to do it again anytime soon. So Lord bless you.
Well, I figure if he wants me to do it right, he'll make a way.
That's it. That's it.
And I know we could talk forever, but I do want to, we got to wrap it up here, but I want to ask you, because so many of our listeners are adoptive and foster parents like you and I. So would you take a moment to just offer some encouraging words to help us as we are on this journey?
Yeah. And even maybe I want to offer a little bit of a practice to families, to something to do. There's an interesting pattern in the Old Testament that whenever God shows up, he commands Israel to build an altar. And so you have all these moments along the way where God shows up and he does something significant among the people, and his response to them is to build an altar. Well, I think adoptive parenting helped me to understand why. because I think what God was up to in that is he knew that there was going to come a time sometime in the future when his people were going to need to walk by that pile of rocks, and they were going to need to remember that he showed up and that he called them and that he said something significant to them. And I think as adoptive and foster families, we need to be in the practice of when God does something important, we need to write it down. We need to commemorate it. We need to remember it. We need to put it into the story of our family, because there's going to be some time in the future when you're going to need to be reminded of that. You're going to need to know that God showed up. You're going to need to remember that he called you to something. You're going to need to remember that he did something significant in you or through you or to someone else by you, because we all have those moments where the enemy reinforces to us and we feel like we've been abandoned, or we feel like we've been left, or we feel like we're wrong. And walking through hard, difficult, sometimes unspeakable circumstances doesn't mean that you've been abandoned, and it doesn't mean that you've done the wrong thing. What it does mean is that it's incredibly hard to focus on truth in those moments. And so I would just say, build a practice in your family that when things are good and when you're seeing God do things of significance, that you write those things down, that you remember them, so that you have them in those times when that's not necessarily the way you feel.
Yeah, such great word of wisdom there, because I know I was a journaler, especially back before I had all of the kids that we have, but those journals were like history books that I could use to write my memoir. But going back through and seeing what the Lord had done and how he brought it all together, and just, it was incredible. So knowing that this is what he called us to, he placed these children into our family. So even on those hard days, because he never said it was going to be easy, right? Didn't we?
That's
Were
right.
promised trials and tribulations, right? But he was going to
That's
be
right.
with us. So
That's right.
it's important to see what God has done, and trust that he still does it. So Dr. Rick, thank you so much for being with us today, for sharing
Thank
your
you.
story, and for all that you guys are doing in and through Lifeline. Pleasure talking with you today.
Well, it's great to talk to you. Thanks for having me. And I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Rick Morton today. Such an incredible story. I'm so in awe of how our story sort of intersected and overlapped with the Ukrainian adoption. But if you want to learn more, there's a link in the show notes. Just go to lifelinechild.org. They have some great programs. You can find the Defender podcast on their website. You can also pick that up wherever you listen to your podcasts as well. So I hope you were encouraged by Dr. Rick Morton today. We're here to encourage you. We're also here to equip you. So be sure to check out our website, justicefororphansny.org, for FASD training and workshops and coaching, and our support group, our online support community for parents and caregivers caring for kids that were prenatally exposed, whether your kiddos have a diagnosis or not. It's the only faith-based FASD support group that I know of in the entire world. So if you want to get in on that, you can learn more on our website. There is a small monthly fee, but we do have scholarships. So if you really feel like you need to be part of that group and you just can't swing the $15 a month, which just covers all of our administrative fee to be able to have 3 support group meetings a month, as well as maintain the private Facebook group and the devotional videos that we release for that, just let us know and we will scholarship you in, because we want to support you for this parenting journey. Please make sure again that you follow or subscribe to our podcast, to the YouTube channel, so that you don't miss a single episode, because we want to encourage and equip you for this parenting journey. Thank you so much for being part of this podcast today.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Adoption and Foster Care Journey podcast, brought to you by Justice for Orphans. We hope you were encouraged today. Please be sure to subscribe to this podcast and leave a review, and share it with your fellow foster and adoptive parent friends so they can be encouraged too. Be sure to find and follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Justice for Orphans, and check out our website for vital resources at justicefororphansny.org.